Hi, my name is Laura Burgoyne, and I'm excited to be joining together with my sister Connie Blackwood in the NOSA Unleashed podcast. Here, we want to expose the stigma surrounding mental health issues by illuminating and discussing real-life challenges and obstacles, keeping us paralyzed and fearful to move forward. Let us inspire you to believe there's more to life than what you're currently experiencing. You can rise from your despair and find hope for the future. It's time to end the silence, remove the stigma of mental health, and to pursue the path to purpose and fulfillment. We will do this together because no one stands alone. Welcome back to the NOSA Unleashed podcast. I'm Laura Burgoyne, and I'm glad to be here today with you to continue our conversation about anxiety and depression. But today we're going to be focusing on a strategy, a 90-second strategy that can actually change your life if you implement it and you put it into practice. And so I'm excited to have Connie here with me, joined in this conversation. Hi, Connie.
Hi.
And so I'm just going to jump right in, Connie, if that's okay. So
Yeah, go for it.
I want to start by talking about stress, because we all experience stress in all sorts of forms. But oftentimes I've thought or questioned, what makes one person handle stress better than another, right? Because you always see some people who, don't handle it well. They get super overwhelmed. It causes them a lot of anxiety, leads to depression, and they get just stuck in these cycles. But then you have another group of people where it seems like, no matter what they have come against them, they just seem to be resilient. They can overcome quickly. And, I have some theories on that, but I've always kind of wondered in the back of my head, well, what makes one person more capable of moving through those stressful and difficult circumstances in their life? And when I came across this 90-second strategy, to honestly, for me, I was like, that's it. That is the key to how some people can navigate quickly through these stressful times. And so that is what I really want to talk about today, Connie. And I think it honestly is a game changer. So if we can get a grasp on this, it can change everything. But before we jump into that, I also want to just bring up, a few statistics. And I think these are important to remember. The average person has about 6,000 thoughts per day. And out of those 6,000 thoughts, about 80% of those thoughts are contributed to negative thoughts that cause chronic stress and affects our brain chemistry. And so I just want you to think about those statistics as we, have this conversation today, because how many, even reflect on your own thoughts, like how many of my thoughts in a given day are negative thoughts, and where are they coming from, and how can I stop them? So the first question I want to bring up is, Connie, have you ever had something happen to you that triggered negative thoughts and feelings, and then you just seem to continually have those same thoughts repeatedly over and over again?
The funny thing is, this happened to me this week.
Okay.
Me and my husband were having some tense conversations, some stressful conversations, and I ended up in this whirlwind of negative thoughts. And I was laying on my bed crying, and I ended up calling you because I was like, I can't keep going on this spiral, but I couldn't get out on my own in that moment. So I was like, can you pray for me? And then after we talked, and then I was able to come out of it. But it was, pretty difficult to get out of it once I'm in it. Once you're in that downward spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the coping mechanisms, but in that moment, I was so overwhelmed with my emotions. I couldn't think straight enough to grab onto those in that moment.
Yeah. It's interesting because I haven't had a chance to share with you this week what I've been through, but I went through a similar situation, but I responded the totally opposite way. I was maybe not opposite, but just in a little bit different. Like, some really, really stressful things happened, and it was triggering me, and I couldn't get past the frustration of the moment. And so then I just withdrew,
Mm.
right? But it was in the withdrawing, in that place where I was choosing not to have to face it and not have to see it all the time. But for me, the outcome was the same. Those thoughts kept repeating, going through, let's call it a hamster wheel. It just keeps going around and around and around, right? And I think that everyone can identify with this. Everyone who will be listening to this podcast, I'm sure you can identify with what we're talking about, because we do. When we are faced with situations, difficult, stressful things, circumstances in our life, people that maybe are not fun to be around or have rubbed us the wrong way, triggered something within us, it starts a thought process. And often there's some chemical reaction in our body, which is what I want to talk about today. And I came across this. Oh, you want to say something,
I
Connie?
was going to say,
Yeah.
since you brought up the hamster wheel, I know that if I was to stop the negative thought process and move the hamster to the positive thought process wheel, I could have empowered myself to move forward through that. But instead, I couldn't get the hamster from one to the other. So that was my big downfall that day, is I didn't implement my tools, my strategies. My emotions overwhelmed me and I just let that hamster go.
All right.
So I hear you about that.
Yeah, Connie, you mentioned a strategy. You mentioned that, and so that I want to bring that up, because a lot of people who maybe are listening to this don't even know what that 90-second strategy is. And I'm going to actually just read a quote from a psychologist. I actually don't remember their name, but you can find them online. And they said, when a person has a reaction to something in their environment, there is a 90-second chemical process that happens. Any remaining response after that is just the person choosing to stay in that emotional loop. And that's so true. I like to call that that 90-second chemical process. I actually see that as, your fight and flight response, right? When you get triggered or something happens in your life, something stressful, it triggers that response in your body. It's an actual chemical reaction that sends chemicals throughout your body and back to your brain. And, you know, that's the moment in time when our brains, justifies or says, this is a real danger. I need to keep this cycle going so I can get myself in a place of safety. But what happens is, a lot of times that chemical reaction happens and it creates that negative thought cycle, but we don't stop it. We just allow that cycle to continue on another 90 seconds, and I think the moment that you start recognizing, wait a minute, I've already been thinking these thoughts, right? You have those revolving thoughts, then you're on that, you're continuing that cycle. And I loved how they said any remaining response after that initial 90 seconds, you're making that choice. And that's what this comes down to, because no matter what we're facing, after that initial chemical response in our bodies, we get a choice. And I'll use an example from my life. I Whenever I have a situation that happens, and this is what happened this week, honestly, with me. I came home and there was a lot of stressful things happening, and it triggers anger in me. And anger is triggered by stress, and it's also, comes as irritability, which is also a symptom of anxiety and depression. And in previous times, I would let that cycle go in my life for weeks upon weeks upon weeks, to the point where it spiraled completely out of control. But this week, I knew what was happening, but it was hard for me to get off the proverbial hamster wheel, because I was just so frustrated with so many things, and it was just like everywhere I turned there was another thing, and it was just overwhelming. But when I could separate myself from the stresses of it all and recognize the fact that, I get to choose the outcome of this, I get to choose how it impacts me and what I do with it, and how it impacts my quality of life, not only in the physical realm, but also in my mental and emotional realm. Like, I have the power to change it, and it's 100% my choice. So if I choose to entertain my negative thoughts, that's my choice. Or I can choose to resolve the issue. I can choose to let it go. I can choose to take a step back and ask myself, well, what's actually true? What's actually happening here? What is, the root behind why I'm being triggered? And as soon as I recognize what's going on, that's the moment that I can make a change when, like you said, I can start replacing those negative thoughts with positive. I can start, putting that hamster instead of on that negative hamster wheel, I can put that one on a positive. Start thinking about all the positives in my life. Think of all the things that are going well that I can, or even the things that aren't going well. How can I change them so that they can become something better in my life? Or, sometimes we have obstacles that, actually needs to encourage us or motivate us to change, right? So in those cases, what are we going to do in our life to actually change to make those situations better? Do you have any thoughts on what I just shared, Con?
I think for me, on Monday, it was after we spoke and I had time to like really think. Then I went back into the situation with my husband, and I basically, like I said, I put the hamster back on the positive wheel, and I was able to talk to him about the situation positively. And then after that, I had the hamster on the right wheel. So then it empowered me to be able to move forward, even though the stressful situation has not dissipated. It's still there, but
Right.
I'm no longer dwelling on this negative thing anymore. Like I've
Mhm.
given it over to him to deal with, and I trust him. And so I've let it not impede me in the meantime, if that
Mhm.
makes any sense. So yeah, that 90 seconds is huge, because if in that moment I had actually implemented my 90-second tool, I wouldn't have ended up like crying in my bed for like at least an hour. And we would have been able to discuss it sooner and resolve things quicker. And so I, in that, looking back, I'm like, oh, I wish I could have implemented it. But sometimes when you're overwhelmed with emotion, even if you know you have this strategy, sometimes it's really hard to implement because your emotions are like clouding your judgment. So
Mhm.
something to watch out for. Because you can have all the strategies in the world, but if your emotions have taken over like your brain, it's really hard to work through that and grasp onto them. But that, I think it just takes practice, to be honest with you. I think the more that I
Mhm.
practice doing that in the midst of my emotion, the better I'm going to get at that.
Yeah,
And the
and I
other
think
thing,
a good Oh, sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
the other thing I'm encouraged by is that in the midst of the moment, when I'm tempted not to call anyone and not to tell anybody what's going on and just deal with it on my own, I was like, no, I need help. I need
Mhm.
someone. And so that was encouraging to me, because that's new for me. Like I usually try to deal with things on my own most of the time. But I was like, no, I really need somebody. And so I'm glad that I did reach out.
Yeah. Wow, it's something you mentioned earlier about, when your emotions, kind of overtake you, it just that's an opportunity where you can really work on the skills of self-regulation, right? And, how oftentimes do we completely lose it on other people just
Mm-hmm.
because we're dysregulated, right? And the whole process of getting yourself to a calm place, you need to take that step back. You need to take that deep breath. You need to reevaluate and to examine, what's actually happening and what are the thoughts I'm thinking and are they true, right?
Yeah.
Because half of the times most of the things that are going through my mind aren't even true.
I'd say for me, it's more like 90%, but yeah, especially that more like that day, like there was so many things going through my mind that were like, this isn't true,
Mhm.
and like, or this is an exaggeration of the truth. It's not completely true, right? Like,
Right. That's true. What you're saying is so true, Connie. I think that we all have opportunity to work on this, but I think the empowering part is the fact that, if we recognize the cycle, right? If we recognize the fact that, stress is normal. The stress response is normal. This is something that happens to everyone. So, no matter what stimulus you have, whether it's, somebody saying something to you that triggered you, or a circumstance that's, out of your control and you don't know what to do about it, or an emotional response to something, you know, the res- that chemical response that we're going to have in our body, it's normal. So don't
mhm,
to be caught off guard by that, but to recognize it for what it is, and then realize that after those 90 seconds of that response happening in our body, we get a choice what happens next. And
mhm.
so I think that's where our power comes in. That's where we have the ability to change our future. And that's really the whole point of today's podcast, is to encourage our listeners that, you might be struggling with anxiety and depression. And like I said, swirling 80% of 6,000 thoughts a day going around your mind that are negative, but it doesn't have to be that way. You have the ability to shift that. And I think a huge part of this too, Connie, is, you know, recognizing it in ourselves and not necessarily pointing it out in others. I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's a huge lesson that we've also learned in this process.
Yeah. My husband tried to, like, I told my husband about this 90-second thing. And then the very next argument we had, he was like, it's past the 90 seconds. So you are totally in the wrong right now. And I'm like, dude, like, I was not happy about that. And it ended up being way worse than if he had just stopped. Because it takes two people to argue, right? And if he had just stopped instead of egging me on with that, then it
Mhm.
could have stopped, right? And on Monday, we were the stressful thing. I was so stressed out and we were having an argument about it that I had to actually say, I need my space. This is my way
Mhm.
of stopping it right now because I can't continue this right now. Because it takes two people to fight. And he had to let me go because he was like, well, if you're
Mhm.
not going to do it, say anything else other than I need my space, then I have no choice. And then we were able to come back and have a like really great conversation about it after the fact because we had both calmed down at that point and we can actually like rationally discuss it, right? But in the
Mhm.
moment, it takes two people to fight, and I had to walk away because I just couldn't. I was making it worse with everything that I said. I wasn't making anything better,
Right.
you know? And so for me, the best thing I could do in that moment was take that space and come back at it later when we were both in a better situation.
Mhm. Yeah, and I had to do that same thing this week because my husband was pressing me, "What's wrong? What's bothering you?" All this kind of things, and I said, "Look, it's in your best interest that we don't discuss this right now. Otherwise, I might like lose it.
Yeah.
Just give me my space. Let me have time to process this. Let me, you know, try to get my hamster off my negative wheel and try to reframe this in a way
Mhm.
that, I won't be so riled up and so, you know? So
Yeah.
yeah, taking that time, taking that space, allowing yourself to like just completely evaluate what's going on, how you're thinking, what you're feeling, validate it, but also, make sure that it aligns with the truth.
Hmm.
Those keys are so, so important. And so, did you have any last thoughts here, Connie?
Yeah. When she says aligned with, like, that it's aligned with the truth, also make sure that it's not an exaggerated truth, because a lot of times, like, our mind will take the truth and then twist it a little or stretch it a little and or compound it a little to the point where it's no longer true. And so it was based on a truth, but now it's not. And so make sure when you're evaluating if it's true, you're not just basing it on what it started as, based on where your mind is at now. And is that completely true? Because sometimes our minds will just twist it just enough that it seems true, but it's not. So watch out for that, because that's what sometimes gets me, right? Because it's just that little bit off, right? Because I went to the point where I was like, oh, my husband doesn't care. Well, he does care, right? But it started with, he doesn't care how I feel about this, and became
Right.
he doesn't care. So he didn't care about my feelings on that topic because he had his own strong emotions on that topic in that moment. So in that moment, he felt like he didn't care about my opinion on it. But later on, when we're discussing it, he had great care about my opinion on it. So like I said, once again, that was, he didn't care about my opinion in that moment on that topic, but it became, he doesn't care about me, which is a
Right.
huge stretch from the actual truth of it.
Yeah. What you just said reminded me of something that I used to tell my kids all the time. There's an acronym called THINK.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would always say to them, think before you speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I want to, take it one step further, is that we need to think before we even speak to ourselves, that self-talk that we
Yeah.
have in our mind. And so the letters of the acronym, the T represents truth. Like, what is true? H represents helpful. Is what
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking helpful? I represents inspiring. N represents necessary. How many times are our thoughts completely unnecessary?
So
We
many.
totally do not need to be having them. And the K is kind. Is what I'm thinking or what I'm going to say kind? Because if it doesn't align with any of those, then we really should, be refocusing and trying to come up from a different place in how we're going to speak to others, speak to ourselves, process the stresses that we're going through, and that would save us a lot of trouble.
And replace those negative thoughts with, like, the things that are those 5 things, right? Like, as you're thinking about that, thinking,
Mhm.
get it? As you're thinking about that and you're going through each of those 5 things, there's going to be thoughts that pop in your mind that are those things. So then grasp onto those and then start your positive hamster wheel going, right?
That's right.
Because once that positive hamster wheel starts going, you're going to change everything. Because ever since Monday, my positive hamster wheel about that situation has been going, and I have complete peace. And the funny thing is, the situation has not changed at all. I
Mhm.
have.
And the more that you can do that, it actually does, you know, shift the brain chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
It actually, if you can train yourself to do this on a consistent, regular basis, those actual times of that 90-second reaction, you're gonna actually find that it happens a lot less frequently because you already can catch it before you get triggered. And
Yeah,
that's the cool part. The more you work these strategies, the more they work for you, right?
that's where the practice comes in.
Uh-huh. So, just as we're closing up, I just want to remind everyone who's listening that recognize that you can control the outcome of your stress, fear, anxiety, and circumstances in your life. They don't have to control you or spiral out of control into anxiety or depression. You can make a change, and it can happen as quickly as 90 seconds. If you'd like to hear more about this topic, you can check out our webinar that we have posted on our website and on our YouTube channel. We'll have the details in our podcast link. And on that note, we're going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next time on the NOSA Unleashed podcast. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the NOSA Unleashed podcast.